right, book of Exodus. And again, I keep on saying we're going to pick up speed here as we get in through some things like the tabernacle, but we're not there yet. So we still have a little bit of ground to cover and some things to learn that are really vital, I think, for our Christian faith. We need to remember that the old law was a precursor to the New Testament. Here, when we get into looking at the tabernacle, which is the building that God, a tent basically, that God had them build here in the wilderness, as a place that he would dwell with them, is just a type of what the real temple is in the New Testament, and that is you and me. We are a temple of God. God dwells in us. So these antitypes, as they're called, types, I guess, these things that we're learning about now in the Old Testament, look forward to and help us to learn how important being a temple of God really is and how to worship God properly. So even though we're not under the old law, and even though we don't have a tabernacle that we worship in anymore, this is not a tabernacle. It doesn't have anything at all, really. The building has nothing to do with any representation of what the tabernacle here that we'll see in just a little while was all about. But we can learn so much from these things that the Jews, how they worship God, the dedication they had, and the way God wanted them to be careful and devoted to him in service. So we left off last time where we've received the 10 Commandments. Just a second here, let me make sure that I got there we go. Left off in Exodus 22, and we're getting some various commandments. And this section now, I even forget what this section is actually about, but it's various commandments that Moses is receiving now by himself. The people have moved back from the mountain. They're too afraid. So Moses is communing to God just personally here to receive these commands. We left off here in verse 29, I think it is, of chapter 22. You shall not delay to offer the first of your ripe produce and your juices, the firstborn of your sons you shall give to me, and of course redeem. And likewise you shall do with your oxen and your sheep. It shall be with its mother 7 days, and on the 8th day you shall give it to me. And so we looked, well, we don't sacrifice oxen and sheep and so on in our service to God, but we do give ourselves to him in service. And we read that over in Romans 12, verse 1 and 2. Paul says here, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice. So it's still devotion to God and putting our interests second, putting God's interests first, and serving him, it just in a different way. We don't do it now by offering cattle. We do it by giving our own service to his cause. Whatever the work, the talents he's given us, we're going to serve God with those talents and take the time and the resources to do that. Okay, this living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Okay, that's where we left off, and then we jump right into chapter 23, which is about justice, and then about Sabbaths and feasts. Okay, let's get right in here. Verse 1, you shall not circulate a false report. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil, as tempting as that is sometimes. Nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. So truth and honesty and justice in legal system, in the courts and among judges is so important. And so we cannot distort the truth for the sake of some purpose we think maybe is even a good purpose. We're supposed to be honest and truthful and just. Do not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. Now that's interesting. Today it's kind of popular to give more credence to those who are poor and let them get away sometimes with things that are criminal activities because they're poor. Well, no, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to treat the poor just as same as you treat the rich. Justice applies to all, one standard. Verse 4, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, and you would refrain from helping it, you shall surely help him with it. Now, what principle is this? actually. If you do that for your enemy, what is that called? Mercy or love. You're considering what's best for him. Now, sometimes we think that only showed up when Jesus came along, but no, this was a principle back here. You're to treat your enemies well. Now, Jesus corrects a misuse or a misunderstanding of this over in Matthew chapter 5. It was common for people to treat those that treated them well, to treat those that were good to them, they would treat them well, but their enemies, no. We treat them poorly if we can get away with it. But Jesus says that's not what you should be doing under the old law. He says here in chapter 5 of Matthew, verse 43, you have heard that it was said you shall love your neighbor. Now that's over in Leviticus chapter 3, I think. So the Old Testament principle, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, that last part is not found in the Old Testament. No, this principle that we're looking at here in Exodus 23 is what is always something God wanted his people to do. He says, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore, you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. You're to be mature. You're to be complete. This is something that perfect doesn't mean sinless. It means full grown. You're to be somebody who treats people like God does in a loving way. So, again, Matthew 5, verse 43 doesn't introduce a new principle, simply correcting their misuse of a principle that they should have known already, especially since it's back here in Exodus chapter 23, verse 4.
That's Leviticus 19:18.
Okay, Leviticus 19:18 is where we have that. You shall love your neighbor, and of course Jesus repeats that first commandment and the second greatest commandment. Okay. We good? Going on? I'm not in a rush. If you have any comments, I might sometimes be going a little quick, but we cover some of these things and then we'll go a little bit further. Let's see, where are we here? Oh, another principle here. Job understood this principle from the old law. When he says in Job 31, as he's trying to understand why the troubles have come upon him, and he makes an argument, well, I've done these things correctly, I've been righteous, I've been good. He says in verse 29, if I have rejoiced at the ruin of him who hated me, or exulted when evil overtook him. And he said, well, basically, I never did that. He was observing the commandment of love and to treat your enemies properly as he was alive. Of course, the whole story of Job and his suffering wasn't based on the fact that he was a righteous man. He was suffering because even good people suffer. So that's a whole different wonderful study in the book of Job. Okay, moving on, next verse, verse 6. You shall not pervert the judgment of the poor in his dispute. So we look at it the other way around now. You don't treat the poor in a special way and let them get away with crimes. No, don't do that. But who's the most at risk in a system, not so much like ours, but in many parts of the world? If you got money, money talks. So you shall not pervert the judgment of the poor in his dispute. Keep yourself far from a false matter. Do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not justify the wicked. So just because the poor has no resources and you've got your people all lined up and the judge, you give him a little bit of money. In fact, the next verse talks about a bribe. That's not right. The poor need to have justice too. Equal justice under the law is exactly what is being taught here. Verse 8, you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. Can you get any worse than that? If you go in and you've got resources and you bribe a judge or you bribe some witnesses, and so that the case comes out the way you want. It's so hard to get around false testimony. It's what was responsible for putting our Savior to death, was false witnesses that were put forward. I don't know if they were bribed. It doesn't say they were bribed, but maybe they were. It just doesn't say. But bribes are terrible things that pervert justice and blind the discerning. Okay, moving on. Verse 9. Also, you shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger. Why? Why do they know the heart of a stranger? Because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. That comes up again and again. Remember that you were a stranger. You were in captivity. Apply that to you and me. We've never really been in captivity physically, but we've been in captivity spiritually. And we should remember, just because now we've received the blessing and the grace of God and are saved based upon his sacrifice and our commitment, doesn't mean that when we look at people that aren't saved, remember, you were like that. So, talk and tread carefully when you talk with people that aren't saved. Don't look down on them as something inferior. That wouldn't be right. Not at all. You were like them. And still are in many ways because we still sin. Okay. Yeah, Kurt, up here. Sam, you got the mic? Up here, Kurt's got a comment to make.
That reminds me of something it's applicable to, something from the New Testament. I apologize, I don't remember the actual passage, but maybe you could elaborate. But it has to do with forgiving someone who has a debt. And I think it was Jesus that mentioned something about this where, someone forgave someone of their debt, and then the other person, when the roles were switched or the situation was switched, they weren't willing to forgive them.
Matthew 18?
Yeah.
Do we have a verse?
Yeah.
Someone want to read?
It's the end of the chapter.
Okay. Why don't you look that up, Kurt? And I think of the prayer of the Lord, the model prayer that the Lord led. I think it says, forgive others as you have been forgiven. And a number of other passages that actually talk about the fact of how we need to be generous and in our forgiving others, especially if we want to be forgiven.
You see how apply this, considering being in the same situation, understanding what a stranger's like if they were strangers.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you're supposed to treat them probably how you want to be treated.
See, Matthew 18. Do you remember what verse that was?
Very last of 23 to 35.
Okay.
That's a lot of verses.
I don't know if somebody else could read it, but because of this, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlements, a debtor was brought to him owing 10,000 talents. Since the man was unable to pay, the master ordered that he be sold to pay his debt, along with his wife and children and everything he owned. Then the servant fell on his knees before him. "Have patience with me," he begged, "and I will pay back everything." His master had compassion on him and forgave his debt and released him. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. He grabbed him and began to choke him, saying, "Pay back what you owe me." So this fellow servant fell down and begged him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you back." But he refused. Instead, he went and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay his debt. When his fellow servants saw that what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and recounted all of this to their master. Then the master summoned him and declared, "You wicked servant, I forgave all your debt because you begged me. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had on you?" In anger, his master turned him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay or repay all that he owned or owed. Yeah, I just want to make an application.
Yeah, I think it's such an important one because you think we should see that just obviously, but we don't. We often treat others in a way different than we're treated, and that's not the way that we would like to be treated. So it's that whole principle, treat others as you would want to be treated. And so that's principle applies. So that's what's being said here too, is that remember that you were strangers, so be kind to strangers. Do not oppress them. Okay, verse 10, 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its produce. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Now why? We're going to see that why in a minute. Sometimes we think, well, it's for this land's sake, and it may be. And I'm not even sure if it says in the Old Testament it was for the land's sake. Here's why here's the why we have here. So let it lie fallow that 7th year, that the poor of your people may eat. And what they leave, the beasts of the field may eat. So that's the reason, is for being loving and caring for those that don't have. And even the beasts need to eat, don't they? So it was that 7th year was so that the poor could gather and store up and have what they need. You didn't harvest on that year. You let the poor come in. And obviously the animals take what they needed. Okay. And they, let's see, and next sentence, in like manner you shall do with your vineyard and your olive grove. Same thing applies. Let it lie fallow on the 7th year, and so others might benefit. Verse 12, 6 days you shall do your work, and on the 7th day you shall rest. We've already had this principle, that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the son of your female servant and the stranger may be refreshed. So that's what God's principle was in the Old Testament. Work 6 days, 7th day you rest. And verse 13, and in all that I have said to you, be circumspect, and make no mention of the name of other gods, nor let it be heard from your mouth. Circumspect, that's 2 words, to look around you, to inspect around. So you be aware that you're not getting into idolatry. Look out, make sure your neighbor is not getting into idolatry. Let's just stay away from this idolatry, because this is why we're going to be heading into the land of Canaan and taking out all those people there, because they have been corrupted by idolatry. So don't you do the same, is what he's telling you. Okay, verse 14, 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year. Okay, 3 times were feast time. We're not going to go into much detail here because not much detail has gone into, but we'll just shortly review the feasts of the Israelites. There were 3 times of the year. There were 7 separate feasts, but 3 major times of the year. In verse 15, you shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. It's not mentioned here, the Passover, but that's part of that. Already studied about that previously when they were brought out of captivity. They kept the Passover and unleavened bread. You shall eat unleavened bread 7 days, as I commanded you at the time appointed in the month of Abib, for in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty. Verse 16, and the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labors, which you have sown in the field, and the feast of ingathering, at the end of the year, when you have gathered in the fruit of your labors from the field. Okay, let's just look at this on a calendar. I know that may not be the kind of calendar you usually look at, but it's one that's helpful as you look and diagram the whole year. Our months are on the inside, January through December. The Jewish months are on the outside. So the month of Nisan, which is also called Abib, by the way, we've talked about that before. You've got the spring feasts, the Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits. These 3 feasts, that was one of the big feast areas. Then you waited 7 weeks until you came to what's in the New Testament is called Pentecost, but here it's called Harvest. It's also called the Feast of Weeks. It had a few different names. That was 7 weeks later. This is the second main feast time, which is more detailed elsewhere in the Old Testament. We're not going to go into it much. It's just kind of general. He's saying, look, 3 different times you're going to lay aside time for me for these feasts. And then we come along till the end of the year, and we have the fall feast of ingathering, it's called in this context. That was the 3rd major feast time. It's also called the Feast of Tabernacles elsewhere. And it includes the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and then where they would go out and actually dwell for a week, I think it was, in booths. They would erect these booths and go out and live in them to remember the time that they were in the 40 years wandering, which hasn't happened yet. But so that's the 7 individual feasts, 3 different feast times, okay? And I know you know nothing about those feasts. Maybe right now we're not going to go into it because it doesn't go into it here. It does later on in Leviticus and Numbers, Deuteronomy. And we'll probably have some more in the book of Exodus later down the road. Okay, any question? All right. Heading on. Verse 17. 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before the Lord God. That's interesting. At least the males are coming in here. Where are the women? Taking care of the kids. Basically, probably. I mean, that's kind of the general idea I've got. But the males are supposed to appear to make these sacrifices and make this devotion. It doesn't mention the women here. Verse 18, you shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor shall the fat of my sacrifice remain until the morning. Don't store it up and continue to use it. You celebrate on that day, and that's the way it is. And that's the end. Verse 19, the first of the first fruits of your land you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil. Oh, let's just stop there for a second. The first of the first fruits. We talked about that last week, bringing the first, the best that you've got. That's what we need to do today. They were to bring the best, the first that they had to give to God before they really used it themselves. And doesn't God deserve that? I mean, look what he gave you. He gave you his best. And gave you his best and only son. So yes, that's the principle. We want to give God what's first. Now this is the second part of this verse here. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Wow, where did that come from? You know, it's a principle that for some reason God put in here just to let us know that we need to be tender people that understand there's some things that are just the way they are. You don't do something like that. There's another one of those over in Deuteronomy 22, verse 6 and 7. If a bird's nest happens to be before you along the way, in any tree or on the ground, with young ones or eggs, with the mother sitting on the young or young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. You shall surely let the mother go and take the young for yourself, that it may be well with you and that you may prolong your days. What? So when you're dealing with the things that you have or don't boil, it's just not right to boil a kid in its mother's milk. I don't know exactly why, but it just isn't. And when you see the birds and you collect the eggs, don't take them on so that you may prolong your day. This was important to God. Some kind of natural kindness that we should have toward living creatures that he's just laying out a few principles that we'll follow that. That's all I can see here, unless somebody's got a different idea. I guess so, or boil it in water. I don't know. But not the mother's milk. Yeah. Okay, moving on. These are small things, I realize, but we'll get through them here. This is actually one we're going to be here a little bit in Exodus 23. It's really interesting to me, at least. In chapter 23, verse 20. Behold, I send an angel before you to keep you in the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Beware of him and obey his voice. Do not provoke him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. I'm going to ask you who this angel is, so be thinking about it. But if you indeed obey his voice and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the Amorites and the Hittites, and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. You shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do according to their works, but you shall utterly overthrow them and completely break down their sacred pillars. Now, this was supposed to happen in just a few months' time. Now, what happens because of their unbelief when they send the spies out here in a few months, they actually end up having to spend another 40 years in the wilderness. But the plan was, God's purpose was initially to do this, and they would go in and possess the land. But who is this angel that's going to be going along with them? Son of God. And we'll look at a verse that probably suggests that. We've already looked at it once. But well, I'm going to hold off for a second because it comes in a certain order in my outline here. But it could be Jesus. Very likely is Jesus. He's mentioned oftentimes in the Old Testament as the angel of God. So it could be that this is the angel. Anybody else have an idea? What was with them constantly as they went through, ever since they left the land of Egypt, what's with them every day and every night? Visually they can see it. Oh, okay, the cloud by day and the fire by night. For 40 years it does not leave them. And I'll read something about that. Mike, what do you think? Oh, you don't have Mike? Okay. And again, this is, to me, it's just, what is this angel that's going to be with them all the time?
I think this is what Isaiah 63, verses 7 through 9 recounts. I will recount the steadfast love of the Lord, the praises of the Lord, according to all the Lord has granted us, and the great goodness to the house of Israel, that he has granted them according to his compassion, according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he said, surely they are my people, children who will not deal falsely, and he became their Savior. In all their affliction he was afflicted, and the angel of his presence saved them. In his love and in his pity he redeemed them. He lifted them up and carried them all the days of old.
Okay, angel of his presence. Interesting. Okay. So what is that angel of his presence? Who is this angel and the angel of his presence? And it's someone that is going to, you have to be aware of and obey his voice. Over here, Mike.
Isaiah said that he was their Savior and their Redeemer.
Yes. Okay. Sam, over here, Mike Brenneman. And I've got a couple ideas to share. You're right. But now, some people say Moses. I mean, he was a messenger of God, and he's a deliverer, and he was with them, and he was faithful as any, and we'll see some more things about him, is that he was a great man in many ways. Mike.
So I've never pursued this at all, the question you asked, but immediately a verse popped into my mind. It was 1 Corinthians 10:4, and it says, speaking of the Israelites in the wilderness, and it says, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ.
And that was the passage that Don was referring to, which we'll look at in just a minute. Yes.
Okay, well, I was sorry I couldn't hear it better. So.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a very good insight, that the angel was very likely Jesus. But it was also with them, I think, in a visual way. And let's look at a few verses about that. And we can have more comments anytime, but I'll show you a few verses. And I think it has to do a lot with the fire and the cloud being a visible testimony of the angel that continued with them all the way. Exodus 13, we've already been there, back in verse 21. And the Lord went before them by day and by night, went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light. So as to go by day and night, he did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before the people. Another verse, chapter 14, verse 19. And the angel of God who went before the camp of Israel moved. This is when the Egyptians catch up to them, and so the angel says, this is that at that particular time, the angel of God, which is probably this angel we're talking about here, who went before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them. I don't know if the pillar of fire and the cloud were the same thing as the angel, but it looked like the angel was the one that was doing this, control of it. Again, that's just what my surmises are. Verse 20, so it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. Thus it was a cloud and darkness to one, and it gave light by night to the other, so that one did not come near the other at all. It's interesting that nobody mentioned Moses, because I think Moses has something to do with this. But we'll look here in just a second here. And then here's the passage you mentioned, or we're referring to, Don, and one that Mike mentioned over in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1 through 4. Since you've already read it, the main point is down at verse 4, the spiritual rock that followed them was Christ. Okay, and follow doesn't mean to chase behind so much as it means that accompanied them was Christ. So this angel was likely Christ. Now, looking ahead a little bit, I want to show you something just real quick. Looking ahead, this is what we're going to have here in a few chapters. We're going to have this tabernacle built and this fire constantly during the night. And I want to read something out of Numbers about this that I think explains a little bit more about who the angel was. So, and you have all the Israel camped around the tabernacle and the fire that's there, and we're going to be talking in more detail about the tabernacle and the articles of the tabernacle too in just a while. But this is a little bit in the future, and we have this in Numbers being said. Now, on the day that the tabernacle was raised up, the cloud covered the tabernacle and the tent of testimony. From evening until morning, it was above the tabernacle like the appearance of fire. So it was always. The cloud covered it by day and the appearance of fire by night. And I'm skipping a few verses here because of time. Verse 18, and at the command of the Lord, the children of Israel would journey. At the commandment of the Lord, they would camp. So here it is, you need to obey the commandment of the Lord. So there's commandments of some kind being given here. As long as the cloud stayed above the tabernacle, they remained encamped. Even when the cloud continued long, many days above the tabernacle, the children of Israel kept the charge of the Lord and did not journey. Verse 22, whether it was 2 days, a month, or a year that the cloud remained above the tabernacle, the children of Israel would remain encamped and not journey, but when it was taken up, they would journey. So a little bit of what they're being told here is by just the presence of this fire and cloud. You stay as long as the cloud and fire are here. When it lifts up, you go, and it leads you. So that's got to be an angel of some kind, and probably Jesus, like we're talking about here. A little bit further, verse 23, at the commandment of the Lord, they remained encamped, and at the command of the Lord, they journeyed. They kept the charge of the Lord at the command of the Lord by the hand of Moses. So Moses is also part of this. I don't know how did they get the command? Well, Moses, as we'll see later, goes before the Ark of the Covenant, and God speaks to him directly there, gives him whatever instruction he wants to give the children of Israel, and they obey it. So, anyway, the angel of the Lord, I think, like Don was saying and Mike, Jesus Christ, the rock that followed them, and it had something also, and this fire and this cloud was a visible sign that the angel was with them. And Moses was the one who was in league with God, obviously his representative, who directed them, by inspiration when God spoke to him. That's my opinion. I don't know, does that make sense? I don't know. Any more comments about that? Yeah, Kurt.
Yeah, I just want I think I know what you mean by, Christ, I know he wasn't born yet, but in this situation or this, you mean like
He was the Word.
the Word, right? That's what you mean, right?
Well, it says actually in the passage, the spiritual rock that followed them, that rock was Christ.
Yeah.
Obviously.
So what it's talking about is basically
Before he became in the world, right? And that he was, and whether it's referring to the fact that the person we know now is Jesus Christ, he was the one that was in the wilderness with the Israelites as they traveled year after year.
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm that, and make sure no one thought, wait a minute, he wasn't born yet, so I just want some clarification. And
Sure, and of course we all believe and understand that Jesus, or the Son of God, is eternal, and so he would have been there, and he was there when he created the world. He was the one who created all things. And he was the one, apparently, it's hard to prove for sure, but it looks like he was the one here talked about as the angel that went with them. And understanding not a created angel, but still a messenger, a servant of God, the Father. Any more discussion? Okay, I don't know. I spent some time on that, I know, but I just think it's so interesting when you look and you read about those things. Who's this angel that God is talking about and mentions in such a way that they need to make sure that they're following his commands? Okay, let's move ahead. chapter 23, verse 25. So you shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and he will take sickness away from the midst of you. No one shall suffer miscarriage or be barren in your land. I will fulfill the number of your days. You'll carry your pregnancy to full term. I'm going to be with you. You're not going to have these kinds of issues that are common to everybody, especially at this time when the medical science was nothing, or was worse than nothing. And they would have certain kinds of medical procedures that were bad for you, like bleeding you and those kinds of things. Verse 27, I will send my fear before you. I will cause confusion among all the people to whom you come, and will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. And I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivite and the Canaanite and the Hittite before you. I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land becomes desolate and the beasts of the field become too numerous for you. So there's going to be a process when this starts. It's going to take a few years. I can't remember how many years it takes. Don, you remember? Don, you want to bring the mic? Yeah. How many years it takes for them to completely possess and take out the residents of the land of Canaan, which they never fulfill completely. But
Right, yeah.
I don't
It
remember
seems
how
to me
long
like it was
Joshua was.
over a period of maybe 10 to 20 years.
Was it that long? Yeah. All right. I didn't think
I
it was
could
that
be
long.
wrong.
But
You better.
it may have been.
Yeah, refer to the book of Joshua.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Go ahead.
yeah, I know what I was going to say. It says, so you shall serve the Lord your God, and he will do this, right? But they never really did serve the Lord. Even though he did, when they first went in, he was ahead of them with the hornet. I said, well, I was in the hornet before you, and to drive out all the. But I'm saying, even today, it's that little word if.
Yeah. And not
If
perfect.
you do
It's not a
this,
perfect
then
if.
he
It's
will
not,
do that,
It's
right?
not a perfect if. It's not like we have to do everything right, but we just want to desire to please God. And when we have a bad day or a week, we just pick ourselves up and get back at it. And if they would have done that, well, they wouldn't have had the 40 years wandering, and they wouldn't have the challenges they faced when they did get into the land of Canaan because of their disobedience. And so again, why it's so important to learn these things, because we have the same God today, generous and loving and patient and merciful, but he says if, you will love me and do what is right, I will forgive you and I will bring you to my heavenly home. And the land of Canaan is a type of heaven. It's a promised land, like we have the promised land of heaven. And so, so important to understand. Bill, back in the back there with his hand up in the dark, that's why I can never see him. Back behind the light.
I find it interesting that, there was a cloud of fire and there was a cloud. And the cloud was also above the tabernacle. The people saw that.
Oh, continually.
Continually. And yet their hearts were so hard that they never inherited the promise. They marched in the wilderness for 40 years.
I mean,
And as I read through this,
it was there when Moses was up. We'll see in a while. Moses up on the mountain for 40 days, and they lost trust in God and made a golden calf and started worshiping it. And the fire was still there, I believe. So what is it there to? But we're no different. We know God is with us. We have every evidence of it, and yet we still fail sometimes and lose our trust and do things and think things we shouldn't.
it's just so when I read that's what hits me the most. They had all these evidences, much like we do today, right?
Yeah.
And yet they weren't even interested.
Yeah.
Too bad.
Let's not do the same thing. In fact, that's this passage over here. I think that in 1 Corinthians 10, if we were to read the whole thing, basically is don't be like they were. In fact, you should maybe read that this next week. I think it says that, if I'm not misapplying. Okay, moving ahead, verse 30, little by little I will drive them out before you until you have increased and you inherit the land. And I will set your bounds from the Red Sea to the sea, Philistia, and from the desert to the river. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall not make you shall make no covenant with them, nor with their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. So you're not supposed to have any of these people dwelling with you when you go in there and defeat them. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. Okay, I thought this is where, yeah, got this little map. Here, and it's hard to see from there, I know, because it's such a big area, but this is the kingdom of Israel. Not until the time of Solomon does it get as great as what is said here by the Lord, where it is from down here, the Red Sea, to the Sea of Philistia, which is the Great Sea of the Mediterranean, and from, what does it say again here? From the river of Egypt, which is, from the river, which is the Euphrates River, down into the, doesn't it say Arabia? From the desert to the river, for I deliver you. Wait a minute, a second here, and I will do it. I'm going to go back for a second here. What does it say? I can't read that. Philistia and the desert, and the desert, that's what I wanted, okay. Which, of course, was, where am I? There we go. The desert, this is the desert of Arabia. So that was going to be their possession. Now we think more of Israel is right in here, which it was originally. They took up kind of this much land. They weren't really up to Euphrates until the reign of Solomon. But that's what they were promised, and that's what they were going to be. If you will do well and follow my commands, you will have this great blessing. Okay. Here we go. Chapter 24. Hey, we did one chapter in one class. Whoa. 24. Okay, it will only be a couple minutes in here, or a few minutes in here. Chapter 24. Israel affirms the covenant. They say, yes, we will do it, Lord. We will do whatever you say, pretty much is what they say. Verse 24, verse 1 through 3. Now he said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron. Who's Aaron? His brother, Nadab and Abihu. Who were they? Those names sound familiar. They were Aaron's sons. We read about them later. What happens to them later when they're offering things to God? They offer strange fire and are burnt up to a crisp on the spot. And in a minute, you'll see that they really had so much opportunity to have faith in the Lord. They should never have done that, but then we're like that too. But here's what, they come up to the mountain, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. And Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but they shall not come near, nor shall the people go up with them. So the people stay down there. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, who were going to be priests. Those three were going to be priests. And then 70 elders, leaders of the people, come up. Verse 3, so Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has said we will do. Okay, that's what they say. That's what we say. Verse 4, and Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. That's why we can read them right now. And they rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and the 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. So an altar to the Lord and 12 pillars representing the 12 tribes. Then he sent young men of the children of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half the blood and put it in basins, and half the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant, the one he just wrote of all the laws that were being delivered by God, and he read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has said we will do, and be obedient. That's what their determination was. And I think they probably were sincere there, just like we are. When we confess the Lord and are baptized, we're going to do what God's going to say, but we don't do it perfectly. They, though, of course, did so very, very carelessly and didn't do a very good job at all. Verse 8, and Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you according to all these words. So the blood was sprinkled on the people. I don't know if it was sprinkled on all 2.5 million people, or if it was just, a gesture that sprinkled on some of the people. Okay. Let's catch these last few verses here, and then we'll wind up. Verse 9. Then Moses went up, also Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel. And there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone, and it was like the very heavens in its clarity. But on the nobles of the children of Israel he did not lay his hand. You don't go before God, and he didn't lay his hand on them. So they saw God, and they ate and drank. Now this is a very unusual circumstance. How they actually saw what was a representation of God, at least. Here he's shown having feet, so he probably looks like a person. And they were allowed to see him. So you talk about the evidence they have. Now, all the people weren't allowed to do this. It was just those 4 and the 70 elders. And we'll probably stop there and talk about this a little bit more next week. It's interesting that in just a few more chapters, Moses asks to see God. And, well, didn't he already see him here? And so there's a different request he's making later on, actually down in chapter 33, where he says, Lord, I would like to see you. And God actually allows him to see his back, because you can't see God's face and live. So interesting things. They were allowed to see some kind of representation of God, so that they might stay faithful and lead the people faithfully. Okay, that's what we got for today. Take a break for a little bit. We'll come back together and worship our Lord together. Thank you for your participation today.